Hi, everybody who's joining us. We're going to give you a second to get in. Make sure that you're comfy, have a cup of coffee, put aside your snow shovel if you're in the part of the world that we are here in Cambridge. All right, it looks like it is 12 noon here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So we will kick off. Hello, good afternoon, or good middle of the night, or good morning, because we know that we have folks coming in from all over the world. And welcome to this edition of PON Live from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School, our first PON Live of 2026, so the occasion to say Happy New Year to our community, and welcome to so many of you, and welcome back to our regular attendees. My name is Nicole Bryant. I'm the managing director here at the Program on Negotiation, and it is my great honor and pleasure to be able to host David Hoffman today for a discussion of his new book, The Art of Impasse-Breaking in Mediation. And I'm going to introduce David more fully in just a moment and kick off the webinar. But first, let me give a little preview of what we have in store for us. So as many of our regular viewers and attendees know, the Program on Negotiation is pleased to put on a series of live events related to our chosen topics. And we have been doing this now successfully for many years. These events are free and open to the public. And we are also recording today's webinar. So as you will see, there's a little recording button at the top of your screen, which means that if you need to leave at any moment, or if you'd like to come back and view, or if you'd like to share with a friend, you will be able to do so. This event will be posted on the PON website probably by the end of the week. I'd like to thank the incredible PON staff who does so much to support our events work. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, getting and answering questions, getting everything set up. So Laura San Pietro, Ken Russell, Luis Reyes, Riley Schretzel, big thanks to all of them. And thanks, of course, to all of our participants for joining and being with us today. We're going to proceed with the discussion. David Hoffman will be presenting for about 40 minutes, and at the conclusion of that time, we will open up to questions and answers from the audience. So I saw some raised hands, but that's not how we're going to conduct our questions this time. If you do have a question, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can input a question anytime, and we will get to those at the end of the session, as many as we are able to in the time that we have allotted. All right. We are here today in celebration, as I mentioned, of David's new book, The Art of Impasse-Breaking in Mediation. David Hoffman is the John H. Watson Jr. Lecturer on Law here at Harvard Law School, an affiliate faculty member with the Program on Negotiation, where he teaches in our Harvard Mediation Intensive and Harvard Advanced Mediation Intensive. Both programs are being held this spring and will be enrolling now. And the question of impasse breaking in mediation is specifically going to be treated in the advanced mediation course. So we know that many folks will be interested in continuing their learning journey there. David is also the founder of the Boston Law Collaborative and an experienced mediator, facilitator, instructor who is just a pleasure to have as a part of our community. So without further ado, I'm going to hand off the virtual Zoom microphone to David. I'm going to turn my screen off, and I will come back to moderate questions in just about 40 minutes. David Hoffman, thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Can you hear me? I'm going to assume that you can hear me. And thank you very much for the kind introduction. I see thumbs up going on the Zoom screen, so I guess that means you can hear me. I so appreciate the hard work that PON does in organizing these events. And PON has played such an important role in the dispute resolution community. So it's a real honor to be here. And the topic of impasse breaking is one that is a frequent part of my practice as a mediator. And so what I'm going to be sharing with folks in this Zoom space today is basically what's in my toolbox. Everybody's got their own toolbox, and mine may be somewhat different from other people's. But I think for all of us mediators, one of our superpowers, a superpower that we aspire to, is thinking outside the box. I have a cat, and of course, I encourage the cat to never think outside the box. And I would say we lawyers are often trained to think inside the box of law and precedent, but mediators think outside the box not only about solutions, but also about process. A second cartoon that I want to share has to do with the concept of beginner's mind. So I'm going to encourage all of us to use the concept of beginner's mind, which basically means asking the judgy parts of our minds to take a step back and create some spaciousness for ideas that might be different from what we're accustomed to. Um, so, why this book? I guess the first answer to that question is that when I was a woodworker for 7 years before I went to law school. I always carried around a Swiss Army knife. It looked a little bit like this. And it was tremendously useful. There were 33 different functions that it could perform. And when I became a mediator, I wanted some version of the Swiss Army knife, basically a guide that would sort of give me a set of tools that I could use in various situations. And I couldn't find one. So I decided to write the book and just show what tools I've developed over the years. And the primary audience, I suppose, is mediators in training, but it's also for people who use mediation, for example, lawyers or in-house dispute resolvers, people involved in any kind of negotiation, really. Also, for experienced mediators, I hope this book will be useful as a way to share ideas. And I've already started getting ideas from my fellow mediators. There's going to be a second printing of the book, and I'm hoping to incorporate some of the ideas that I hear from experienced folks. So the agenda for this talk is going to be process interventions and substantive interventions, and then we'll have some Q&A. And let me just offer a caveat to begin with. First of all, my practice in mediation is mainly family, business, employment, construction, insurance, intellectual property, a wide variety of disputes. But there are certain kinds that I'm not involved in. For example, large, complex public policy or environmental cases. There are cases involving union and management that I typically don't get involved in, although I do individual employment cases. So there are some specialized areas that might have a different set of tools. So what I'm going to share with you comes from my particular experience. The second caveat, you know the saying, we teach what we want to learn. So I've come here not just as a teacher, but as a learner, and I really welcome your questions. I anticipate that I will learn from them. So please feel free to pose comments, questions, reactions in the Q&A. Here's the premise for the interventions I'm going to describe. There are 30 process and 30 substantive interventions described in the book, along with some other features of the book, which I'll describe. And there's a real fork in the road when we hit challenges as to whether we're going to look for some kind of process solution or we're going to look for a substantive solution. And what I'm going to share with you are a set of ideas, some of which are about process and some of which are about substance. And I'm going to share with you very, very briefly about a third of the impasse-breaking techniques that are described in the book. And the premise for all of them is that the mediator has done the basics already. The mediator has heard the parties' respective accounts of what happened, has explored their feelings about what happened, has elicited their underlying interests, has brainstormed options, and the parties with the mediator have considered their best alternative or most likely alternative to a negotiated agreement. And now they're still stuck. What now? So the first step, it seems to me, is to diagnose the settlement barriers. Why hasn't the case settled? And sometimes the reason is because there's missing information. I have a case right now involving a business divorce. It's a couple who created a business together. and they're getting a divorce, and therefore they have to divide the business. Well, the question is, well, what's the business worth? How much is one spouse going to pay the other in this buyout? And there's a very important piece of information which is uncertain right now, which is their tax liabilities. And they are really going to have a hard time settling the case until they know what that number is. I'll talk a little bit later about contingencies. But what they decided to do, and I think this was a wise decision, is to hit the pause button on the mediation until they fill in the missing puzzle pieces about their tax liabilities. Are there missing people? I remember years ago mediating a case in which a really tragic case involving a death in a nursing home. And the elderly parent, died under circumstances that the adult children thought might have been abuse. And they planted a secret camera in their parents' room at this nursing home. And after she died, they looked on the camera and they discovered that indeed she was being mistreated. And in order to settle the case, at the first mediation session, the CFO of the nursing home company showed up and was asked by the plaintiff family members to watch the video of how their parent had been mistreated. It was an incredibly powerful event. However, when the case didn't settle that day, the plaintiff said, "We need the CEO to come to the next mediation session and watch the video." And when the CEO came, the case did settle. On a more mundane note, there are lots of cases in which insurance adjusters, let's say there's insurance in a case, the adjuster isn't there or is only available by phone or Zoom. Sometimes you have to bring the key stakeholder into the room to get cases settled, whether it's a physical room or a Zoom room. Sometimes changing the players. Oh, I want to go back to missing people because I have to, with all that, I don't know, the heaviness of losing an elderly parent. I have a lighter story to tell, which is about a couple that wanted to stay married, and so they decided to mediate their dispute. It turned out the real stakeholder was the husband's mother-in-law, and so she was the missing person. But the wife said, "No, I don't want to be there for that conversation." So I said to the husband, "Where do you think would be a good place to have a meeting with your mother-in-law?" He said, "Bagel shop. She loves bagels." So we went to the bagel shop, had a great conversation. The bagels were terrific, and we settled the case. So think about who are the stakeholders, who needs to be at the table, and let's get them there. Changing the players. One of my cases in the recent past involved a complicated uh, employee stock ownership plan. And there were some very senior lawyers involved, and they brought their junior lawyers, and they brought their expert witnesses and their paralegals. There was quite a troop of people on each side. And the senior lawyers, my experience is that senior lawyers usually get along with each other, but these two couldn't stand each other. They couldn't be in the same room together. So we tried working with the junior lawyers, but that didn't work because they didn't have the authority. But the expert witnesses knew each other, liked each other, and had the authority to settle the case, working with their respective sides. And so a lot of the mediation got done using these expert witnesses. And when we worked out the terms, the junior lawyers came in and we wrote it up. So changing the players can sometimes change the vibe, so to speak, and make it possible to settle the case. Now, I want to mention a player who's recently come into my mediations, and this is my assistant mediator, Bella, who is a rescue golden retriever from Serbia, of all places. And we've put Bella on the Boston Law Collaborative website as our senior mascot and assistant mediator. And I always ask the parties if we're going to have an in-person mediation, are they allergic or do they have a dog phobia? And if they don't, I ask them if it's okay to bring Bella. And the parties may dislike each other, but everybody likes golden retrievers, at least everybody that I've met. And Bella has terrific relational skills, and she goes from room to room with me. And she's also willing to work pro bono, to make a very silly joke. So I highly recommend, if you have a dog, like dogs, and think the parties in your case might like having someone, a dog like Bella, with you. It really does help. Okay, I'm going to jump through the next few quickly because I'm trying to pay attention to the time here. Partial settlements. So often we talk about picking the low-hanging fruit to establish some momentum. And I think that's a great idea. And writing up these partial agreements, I think, is really helpful. I think it's important to remind people that they're not committing to whatever is in the partial agreement. We don't have a deal until we have an entire deal. However, when people see in writing that actually there are quite a few points that are points of agreement, and maybe a couple of sentences that have blanks in them that need to be filled in, it causes people to feel more optimistic. Mediators need to be good triage uh, agents in the dispute resolution process. And what I mean by that is we need to be familiar with all the varieties of dispute resolution, not just mediation. And very often there might be a piece of a case that can be bifurcated or trifurcated or separated out from the main case and submitted to fact finding or arbitration, either binding or non-binding. Sometimes the arbitrations are with brackets to limit risk. Sometimes it's with blind brackets so that the arbitrator doesn't know what the brackets are. There are also variations on arbitration called baseball arbitration, which is each side makes their last best offer. So our creativity and working with the parties to think through some of the other ADR processes that can be used can be enormously helpful in breaking an impasse. Narrative, because sometimes you're stuck. And I find that going to stories can sometimes help people get unstuck because it helps them see each other more three-dimensionally. And the case I have in mind was a race discrimination case in which I heard in each separate room as I was going back and forth using shuttle diplomacy, I heard about how deeply committed the plaintiff's lawyer was to fighting race discrimination. He grew up in the South. He had seen how his parents had been mistreated. They were sharecroppers. And he made a vow that he would devote his career to fighting race discrimination. And interestingly, the lawyer in the defense room had made a similar commitment when he first became in-house counsel for this large company. And he told me about his journey becoming aware of race discrimination. And I thought it would be really helpful if these two could tell each other the stories of how they came to be doing what they're doing. And they agreed that they would meet together with the clients present. And it was a really powerful conversation. I wasn't asking them either side to make a concession. I just wanted them to hear about each other's journey. And after that, they went back to their separate rooms and the case settled. As Ursula Le Guin wrote, the story is one of the most basic tools invented by the human mind for the purpose of understanding. There have been great societies that did not use the wheel, for example, in certain parts of Polynesia, but there have been no societies that did not tell stories. Identifying possible trades. So here's an example from a divorce mediation in which the parties had a lot of assets. Some of them were in very risky private equity investments, and some of them were in very conservatively invested equities and bonds, publicly traded. And the parties had different risk tolerances, and the one of the spouses was very comfortable with risk, and the other was extremely uncomfortable with it. And so instead of dividing all of their financial assets right down the middle, which is probably what a court would have done, we worked out a trade where spouse A got more of the high risk, high reward, high potential reward private equities, and the other spouse got the stocks and bonds that were publicly traded. So the fact that the parties have different interests, different values, and different risk tolerances can really be helpful in terms of expanding the pie and making both of them better off. Metaphor. This is one of my favorite topics because metaphor operates at a sort of subconscious level in a very powerful way, at least in my experience. I'm not a psychologist, but I am a consumer of the work that cognitive psychologists and social psychologists do, and they have found that metaphors work well. And here I'm going to share with you three metaphors that are part of my practice. And the first one is about the rear view mirror and the windshield. Some of you may know this one. I often describe mediations to the parties as being like in a car where our main focus is the future, not the past. On the other hand, we're not going to ignore the past, just as if you were in a car, you wouldn't want a car with no rear view mirror. But if the rear view mirror was as big as the windshield, you'd never get anywhere. So I found that after introducing this metaphor, sometimes the parties would jump in if things were getting heated, contentious, and focused on the past. And one of the parties would say, I think that's a rear view mirror conversation. Let's focus on the windshield. And I thought, yes, let's do that. Another metaphor that I find helpful is whitewater rafting. When things get contentious, when it feels like an impossible impasse has been reached, I remind people that in whitewater rafting, if everybody stays in the boat and they don't hit each other with the paddles and let the river guide manage the steering, we'll eventually get through the whitewater and get to more placid waters and get the case resolved. And finally, this metaphor, which I have used in lots of divorce cases where the parents are in a very contentious posture vis-a-vis the kids. And I suggest to them that their role is really to be co-pilots of the passenger plane, and the kids are the passengers. And what they want to do is they want to close the door to the cockpit and make sure that the kids, and turn off the intercom so the kids don't hear the parents bickering. And, you know, every now and then provide reassuring messages over the intercom to let them know that the parents are doing fine. And I have found that very often parents, when their job is reframed as being jointly responsible for the safety and well-being of their kids in the way that this photographic image suggests, is really helpful to them. Food. We all know that eating together, breaking bread together can be a good bonding experience. And I've had a number of cases where if the parties are willing to have lunch together, and the ground rule is we're not going to talk about the case, again, people start seeing each other more three-dimensionally, and that helps resolve the case. Mahatma Gandhi said, speak only when it improves upon the silence. And I love that quote. And I think when we're at an impasse, it sometimes helps to say to folks in a candid and transparent way, you know, we seem to be at an impasse. I wonder, you know, what your thoughts are about how we might overcome the impasse here, and then just embrace the silence. It may be uncomfortable. I find that it often is uncomfortable because I tend to be wanting to jump in, but I have to embrace the silence and let's see what folks have to say. Taking a break, distraction is sometimes useful. In the book, I share a story from Eric Galton, who's a very experienced mediator, who found that going for a walk around the lake outside his office with one of the parties who was kind of stuck broke the deadlock. And maybe it's because people just needed to decompress. Maybe it's because this particular party who was kind of stuck needed some special attention, needed to be seen more three-dimensionally. He was the CEO of the company that was being sued. Whatever it is, think about whether taking a break might change the whole dynamic in a useful way. Um, Apology can be really powerful tool, and sometimes there have been many reports uh, from mediators about sometimes an apology being sufficient by itself to settle a case. Now, the cases I'm involved in usually don't get resolved with just an apology. But how does a mediator elicit an apology? And one of the ways that I've found useful is in private caucus sessions to ask the parties if you could roll back the video of what happened that led to this mediation, is there something you would do differently? And I find that usually they say, yes, I would have, communicated more clearly about this, or I would have tried to attend to it earlier. I would have brought some other people in from outside to resolve it. And I'm sorry I didn't do that. I said, well, does the other side know that? Well, usually the answer is no. So I also find out in the other room if there's something they would have done differently. Mutual apologies work much better than unilateral, but sometimes it's hard to tee up mutual apologies. Any apology at all, in my experience, has the potential of breaking an impasse. Um, Now we're going to get into some of the more technical, substantive interventions. And the first one I want to talk about is case evaluation, a fairly controversial topic within the field of mediation. Now, one way to do case evaluation is to ask the mediator to do it. When people ask me to do that, I often say, well, maybe it would be better to have a retired judge or senior lawyer jointly hired come in and do it, because if I provide a case evaluation, I may lose my effectiveness. People might feel that I'm taking sides, and then that would not be helpful. I find that sometimes they're willing to bring in an outside retired judge or expert. More often, they want me to do it. And if I'm going to do it, then usually what I want to do is quantify the risks in the case using a decision tree. And this is from a piece of software called Triage or Triage, Treeage. You can find it online. And it shows how a case that has the potential value of $31 million, or one part of a case, when you factor in all of the various uncertainties and risk nodes in the decision tree, the risk discounted value of the case is a bit under $1 million. Um, the, um, the American Bar Association has recently issued an opinion about lawyer mediators. Obviously, the ABA doesn't have jurisdiction over mediators who are not lawyers. But for mediators who are lawyers, this recent opinion from October of 2025 is worth reading. And it deals with case evaluation. It says a mediator may offer an opinion as to how a tribunal is likely to rule on an issue, but should not, lawyer mediator shouldn't state or imply that a settlement is in a party's best interest, because we're not fiduciaries for the parties. It's the lawyer's jobs to advise the parties about what's in their best interest. Now, there are a number of mediators who take exception with this part of the opinion about talking with people about their best interests, because that's sort of the heart of what mediators do, is talk about people's interests. So there will be much discussion in the months and years ahead about this opinion. But if you practice in the United States, and if in addition to being a mediator, you are a lawyer, I encourage you to read this opinion. And by the way, and so this is as a matter of legal ethics for mediators who still carry a bar card. If you are a mediator in another jurisdiction, for example, in Florida, a principle of mediation ethics, not legal ethics, but mediation ethics, is that mediators should not offer an opinion about the value of a case. So for those of you in jurisdictions outside the United States, your mileage may vary. You should check what your rules are. And even within the United States, it's important to think about what are the ethical rules that I am bound by. In Massachusetts, we have some rules that suggest that doing case evaluation should only be done when the parties are informed that the mediator is changing roles from mediator to case evaluator. Use of hypothetical proposals. So if I know that even though the defendant has, the defendant has proposed a $200,000 settlement, but has told me confidentially that they could maybe by the end of the day get up to $600,000. But they asked me to keep that under my hat. At some point in the mediation, I may want to go to the plaintiff who's up at, $1.5 million, and is very frustrated. The defendant's only at 200,000. And after some bargaining back and forth, I might ask the plaintiff if I could get the defendant up to, 600,000 or thereabouts. Do you think that would be enough to settle the case? And the plaintiff might say, no, it's not. But if you can get them up to 8, I think we can do a deal. So now I've got some bookends that are much closer than the numbers that are on the table. And I haven't revealed what parties have said to me. I've just put it out there as a hypothetical. Judge Toro, the late Judge Toro in the Massachusetts Federal District Court, used to use this technique. I watched him do it, and I've used it in my mediations now because he did it very effectively. He would ask each side to write down on a piece of paper, sitting in his chambers, their very best offer, and fold it up and give it to the judge, or in this case, give it to the mediator. And then he would look at the 2 pieces of paper and tell them, well, we need to schedule a trial date, or go out in the hall, I think you can settle this. Very useful information. So when I do it as a mediator, I find after this exercise, sometimes the parties say, sort of tongue in cheek, I'll show you mine if you show me yours. And then they open up the pieces of paper and find out they're not actually that far apart. So again, the bookends have moved closer, and if they're within a distance that is comparable to the transaction cost of trying the case, there's a good likelihood the case is going to settle. I'm going to talk about 2 techniques in some length now, one mediator's proposal and one range bargaining, as we get into the home stretch here before we go to Q&A. And this one is somewhat controversial, the idea of a mediator's proposal. Now, of course, in diplomatic annals, mediators' proposals happen all the time. Jimmy Carter, meeting at Camp David in 1979 with Anwar Sadat and Malcolm Begin, was able to put forward some ideas that they were willing to accept and reached an historic accord. Mediators can do this also, and there's in commercial and family and employment cases, and I'm going to describe the methodology. But first, let's define our terms. Mediator's proposal is not case evaluation. It's a prediction of what the parties will do. Case evaluation is a prediction of what a court would do. There are specific ground rules for an effective mediator's proposal. And it can only be done if the parties are in separate rooms. So first of all the parties need to want a mediator's proposal. Second, the mediator should talk with the parties about what the items should be in the proposal. For example, do we need to address the tax treatment of a settlement or confidentiality of a settlement or any other ancillary terms? If we can boil it down to, yes, we have agreement on those things, the one issue is the amount of money that's going to change hands. That's the typical setting in which a mediator's proposal is used. And so the mediator makes the same proposal in each separate room and asks the parties not to respond right away. I want to be able to go into the other room not knowing what the response was in the first room that I went into. I give them time to think about it, and the parties need to agree in advance about a time limit. I had one case recently where one of the parties wanted an extra hour, 2 hours, and ultimately they wanted a few days. And it really was a very uncomfortable dynamic. So think about the time limit in advance. And then the mediator returns to each separate caucus room to find out confidentially, very important, whether the response is yes or no. The mediator reports the responses only if there are 2 yeses. And what that means is that each side can take the risk of saying yes, and the other side won't know that they said yes unless they too said yes. Um, in my discussions with mediators around the United States and in some other countries, what I found is that approximately 80% of cases settle using a mediator's proposal, and typically it's used toward the end of case. But the other 20%, half of those, 10% of the cases settle after the mediator's proposal, even though there was, say, one yes and one no, because again, the parties say, well, I'll tell you what our response was, and they realize they're not that far apart. I'm going to give you an example of a specific case with a mediator's proposal in just a minute. But in the 10% of the cases where there were two no's and parties are somewhat far apart, it doesn't mean the mediation is over. We simply go back to bilateral bargaining. We think about the other impasse breaking techniques. Maybe the case should be sent to arbitration or a portion of it, or maybe it needs case evaluation or some other intervention. Now, when I'm going to do a mediator's proposal, I actually, here's a hypothetical case, and I'll show you the graphic that I use to explain the process to the parties. So let's say the plaintiff has demanded $6.5 million and the defendant has offered $250,000. And by 6 p.m., the parties are stuck at 2 million and 1 million. And they want a mediator's proposal. Now, having had private discussions with each of them, I have some sense of kind of where they're coming from. And I have to, pay attention not only to the words, but to the music. This is really an intuitive task to some degree, at least as much as an analytical task. And so what I do is I make a drawing. I say, I know for certain that the plaintiff would settle at $2 million, and that there's zero chance that the plaintiff would settle at $1 million. And likewise, I know for certain that the defendant is willing to pay $1 million, and I know for certain that they would not pay 2 million. So the question is, where do these curves intersect? In other words, where is the zone of possible agreement such that if you move to the left or move to the right, you'd be reducing the overall possibility of a settlement? Now, that crossover point might be over here or it might be over there. In some cases, there isn't a crossover point, but we may not know that until we try out the mediator's proposal. It's often the case, if you look at the statistics of negotiations and settlements, it is typical that plaintiffs usually move a higher percentage off of their base number than defendants do. So let's say I made a mediator's proposal of $1.4 million. After doing that, I would have some information. First of all, the case might settle. But if it doesn't settle, I have information that at least one of the parties doesn't have. The party who said yes also has that information. And with more information about people's settlement positions, cases can settle. Now, I mentioned range bargaining, and this one might be less familiar to some of the mediators here in the Zoom room. The best way to explain it, I think, is to give you an actual case. And this, so the process involves making a proposal of a range instead of a specific number. This was an employment discrimination case, and the plaintiff had been fired, and the defendant immediately offered an $18,000 severance package, and the plaintiff demanded $230,000. This is before any mediation, and then hired a lawyer and increased their demand to $307,000. I don't remember why it was that specific number. But they then decided to hire me as their mediator. And when the mediation began, the defendant immediately increased, even though they were upset that the plaintiff had increased the demand, they put $30,000 on the table. And the plaintiff came down from 307 to 290. Now, the defendant realized that this was going to be a problem because the plaintiff had only moved $17,000. And if those were the increments that people were going to move, it was going to be a very long day and maybe not a successful day. So they spontaneously, I didn't ask them to do this, they said, we're going to propose a range. Tell the plaintiff that we will come up to $50,000 if they'll come down to $110,000. And plaintiff, when I communicated that, said, no, we're not willing to come down to $110,000, but we will come down to $190,000. That's coming down 100,000, big number, big jump. If they come up to $60,000, in other words, doubling the 30 that was on the table and or increasing the 50 that they had conditionally offered. The defendant said, no, we're not willing to come. Well, no, they said, we are willing to come up to 60, but you have to come down to 120. And the plaintiff said, no, we're not willing to do that, but we'll come down to 150 if you come up to 70. You can see what's going on here. Nobody has agreed to anything, but the numbers are getting a lot closer. We now have bookends that range from, say, 80,000 to 120,000. It looks like this case is going to settle. When the defendant came back with a proposed range of 85 to 95, the plaintiff said, we want a mediator's proposal. And the defendant said, fine. So I made a proposal basically using my intuition of how far I thought the parties would be willing to go, of $93,000 plus an additional $4,000 that the plaintiff wanted because they had each side had paid $4,000 as the deposit for the mediation, and they wanted their money back. So that would have been $97,000. And the responses I got to this proposal were the defendant said, sure, we'll do that. Of course, they said it confidentially, and the plaintiff rejected it. So at that point, I just communicated we don't have a deal. Now the ball was in the plaintiff's court because the defendant had made the last range proposal, and they proposed 99,000 plus the mediator's fee of 103,000 altogether. And the defendant said, no, we're not willing to do that, but we'll write you a check for 95,000, reimburse your 4,000. So essentially a $99,000 settlement, and that was accepted. And if you want to see what the parties were thinking while this was going on, you can see it in the color-coded numbers. So the plaintiff was paying very close attention to these yellow numbers. The defendant was going up 18, 30, 50, 60, 80, 85. They saw the defendant hitting the brakes, which is why they asked for a mediator's proposal. Meanwhile, the defendant is looking at the plaintiff's numbers from 290 to 190 to 150 to 120. They're seeing significant movement, and everybody on both sides is paying attention to the green numbers, which are the midpoint of the range. And so you can see, if you look at the midpoint, there's convergence here. We're getting very close to being done. Range bargaining doesn't work for every case. It's not appropriate for every case. And some people, frankly, find it mysterious and off-putting. But I'm finding more and more in cases where lawyers are involved, this is familiar and useful. We're almost at the point of taking Q&A, so let me go quickly. Contingencies basically are, building into the settlement agreement things that will happen depending on the future. So, for example, an earn-out. One company is buying out another company, and they're willing to pay more if it turns out to be profitable in the future. That's what we call an earn-out or profit sharing. There are arrangements for indemnification if there are uncertain risks, or tax sharing if there are uncertain tax liabilities, or inspection or financing or appraisal contingencies that might be necessary in the purchase of real estate or a business. Sometimes building in a right of first refusal if the property at issue is going to get sold. Dual offers. This is one of my favorites. One side is saying, we know that our proposal of $1 million is going to be a tough sell in the other room. They're only willing to pay $250,000. But we really believe this is a $1 million case. And so here's what we're going to do. And I often coach them and suggest this might be a useful strategy. We're going to propose our $1 million. And we're going to propose in the alternative that if they don't want to settle at $1 million, let's jointly hire a neutral independent case evaluator and find out what somebody thinks the case is worth, non-binding. We're happy to do either one. We'll settle for $1 million, or let's go to case evaluation, because we think the case evaluation will come in even higher. And that kind of either or kind of proposal can sometimes be very effective in blunting the sticker shock that might land when one side thinks the other side is either too high or too low. Auctions are often very useful, whether it's a public or private auction of a piece of real estate or a business or some other property. It could be intellectual property. Public auctions will yield a higher price. Private auctions will maintain confidentiality. I also love this technique called the adjusted winner auction, which I sometimes use in family cases, where there are a whole bunch of belongings. I've listed 4 here, but sometimes the list is very long. And the parties, the two spouses, fill out a sheet privately, a bidding sheet of what they're willing to pay. And then they get the item if they're the higher bidder, but they get it at the average price between the two. So spouse A is going to get the piano, but not at the 5,000 that spouse A was willing to pay, at 3,500 because spouse B was only willing to pay 2,000. And you can see how that would reduce envy and regret and make for a more stable solution. This is the last one, and then I have a couple of thoughts before we go to Q&A. I've developed this 3 appraisal protocol that I find really useful when there's a dispute about value. The parties jointly hire one appraiser and negotiate. If they don't settle it, they jointly hire a second appraiser, then they negotiate. If they still don't agree, they hire a third appraiser and then average the results, and that's binding. I've only had one case where they ever got to the third appraiser. They usually agree because they don't want it to be taken out of their hands. And the protocol also involves rejecting outlier appraisals. So you pick the 2 that are closest to the middle if one is defined as an outlier by being, say, more than 15% different from the average of the other 2. So the other parts of the book, which I'm not covering, are things like impasse prevention, deal points, challenges and pitfalls, and techniques to avoid, and some case studies. But right now, I'm going to hand the baton over to Nicole Bryant to see what questions we have. And thank you all for being with us for this conversation today.
David, I'm so glad you put up some of the things that you didn't talk about because there is so much in here that you weren't able to cover, of course, in, just these few minutes. So everyone, I really do encourage you to grab a copy of the book. I think this was an incredibly rich presentation, and I know we're not going to cover everything in Q&A, but we will do our darndest to get to a fair amount. David, we have a few different questions pertaining to the use of emotions in the context of contentious mediation. So a question from Johnny says, in the book, you talk about Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 thinking and moving people into a space where they're behaving more logically. But the question from Johnny is, can the opposite sometimes be helpful? Can it be helpful to get people to an emotional place to generate empathy, for example, with an opposing party? Or do you tend to feel that logic is really the best and only place to keep your parties at?
That's a great question. I love that question. And it sort of depends on where the parties are in their stuck place. So I believe I mentioned in the book a case where a doctor, a very eminent doctor, was suing a foundation that he had founded, and he had been voted off the island. He was offered a lot of money as severance, and he was so emotionally stuck in the indignity of having been voted off an island that he created, that I asked him to make a T-chart with the advantages and disadvantages of the deal. And as he picked up the pen to start writing, he looked at me, he said, "I get it. It's very hard to be emotional about this if I have to write down, these advantages and disadvantages." And then the case settled. So in that case, the premise of the question that you just shared is that that can work, but the reverse can also work if there is some emotional piece that needs to be exchanged. The question is, how do we tee up that exchange so that it doesn't blow up the case? And sometimes it means the mediator translating the emotion that's in one room to the other, or convening the parties for face-to-face conversation, where the parties agree that the mediator can interrupt if things get heated, and ask people to, speak from the heart, I statements, not blaming statements, and to talk about what wound was triggered by the conflict that they're in a personal way. I find that that kind of exchange, which can be so useful, so powerful, so transformative, has to be prepared. Sometimes they happen spontaneously, and the mediator gets lucky. And If there's time, I'll tell a story about Ken Cloak mediation
Sure, go ahead.
that exemplifies that. But let's see what other questions
Okay.
there are.
Well, so precisely just to continue on this emotions bent, we have a question from David who asked, do you agree that using the caucus method minimizes the risk of emotions boycotting the process? And you were just talking about different rooms. So is that your general predilection for the caucus method when you're trying to avoid a boycott by emotions, as David puts it?
Yes, very definitely the case. However, I want to be alert for ways in which the having a more personal face-to-face exchange could be useful. I would say in the majority of commercial cases, caucusing is what mediators here in the United States are doing. And in family cases, it's the reverse. They're spending more time with the parties together. But one thing that I now do that I didn't used to do when I first started mediating relates to this question. And even in the driest of commercial cases, I tell the parties in advance that when we meet, I'm going to just have a general procedural joint meeting to talk about ground rules. Then, my first caucus meeting with each side, I'm going to ask the clients to tell me the story of what happened in their own words. And by having a private caucus session with them, I'm telling them I want to hear about the emotions. What was the impact? And I find that doing that gets me into a more up close and personal relationship with the parties. So that's helpful. And I also figure out whether there needs to be an exchange and whether an exchange could be productive or would likely be destructive. So I'm trying to do some diagnosis, process diagnosis in doing that. And then I tell them, don't worry, we will get to the numbers in the second round of caucuses. But by preparing them for the process that I propose, they don't have to do it that way, but generally they agree that sounds fine. They don't get antsy about the fact that it might be 11 a.m. before we get to some actual numbers.
Mm-hmm. David, we have a number of questions about the mediator's proposal, and this has solicited a number of points in the chat. Amongst them, can you talk about the conditions that need to be fulfilled to advance one? And also, do you see any pitfalls or possible backfires to a mediator's proposal? And then we have some specific questions on ABA Formal Opinion 518, and the advice for a mediator not offering a particular solution as opposed to the council, but there are times, of course, when parties are not represented by council. So I've thrown a lot of different varieties, and you may
Yes,
take a minute to respond to those. Thank you.
sure. So first of all, the conditions that would indicate possible value of mediator's proposal are that momentum has slowed, maybe to a stop. As long as there's momentum in the bargaining, I'm not thinking mediator's proposal. I'm thinking, let's see if we can, get this done with bilateral negotiation in a two-party case, but it could be a multi-party case also. So that's one indication. Second, I want the parties to understand that my effectiveness as a mediator could be impaired by a mediator's proposal because one side or the other might think I'm taking sides. So I have to kind of inoculate the process against the perception that I'm taking sides. I'm simply making a prediction of where I think the zone of possible agreement might lie. As to the ethics, the ABA opinion is so new that there's a lot of sort of formative thinking about this, but there's nothing in the opinion that says that mediators can't offer a mediator's proposal. The opinion is really about whether we say to the parties, this is what's in your best interest to do this. Lawyers are not only permitted to do that, but they're sort of, as a matter of professional responsibility, required to do that. But mediators don't have that same kind of fiduciary responsibility. And it's seen by many mediators, including me, by the way, as maybe in tension with self-determination, which is a bedrock principle of mediation.
Great. Thank you so much. And I know that we could have gone on even longer, but I but I appreciate your concise response. We have a question from Lillian about narratives, which was one of the initial points that you brought up. How do you invite parties to share that? At what point? Is it right at the outset? Is it, how do you get into a space where you're asking folks to bring those powerful stories to the forefront?
Well, let me use the example of family mediation because I indicated that most family mediators meet with the parties jointly. But I always meet with parties at least once separately because I want to hear their story. I want to hear their narrative. I want to hear what happened, what led to the decision to divorce, or when I work with adult siblings, what led to this breakdown in the family relationships. And I find that they're much more comfortable sharing those stories with me in a private session. Also, in family cases, divorce cases, I need to meet with people separately. I think all mediators do at least once to do domestic violence screening. Once I hear the stories, then I try to get a sense of should we bring people together to share these narratives? Will that be productive? And I find that it often is, because while you can disagree with an argument or a position, you can't disagree with a narrative. It is what it is. It's a story. However, if it's a blame saturated narrative and the other person is in the story, that's where we run into trouble. And that's why hearing the narrative separately is often a good first step. Because it's very easy for somebody to tell a story and think that they're telling it objectively, but there are all kinds of zingers embedded in the story that are going to cause a blow up on the other side.
Yeah. All right, I think we're probably getting towards our last questions. Unfortunately, one is very concrete. David, could you please put up the slide that showed what you weren't able to cover, and we can kind of talk over it if you don't mind doing that. Well, at the same time, we have a number of questions asking about imposing time restrictions and whether that's something that you do to help break an impasse or whether it's actually something that you try not to do. So everybody, here's the cover of the book with all the things that David wasn't able to cover, or at least a partial list of what David wasn't able to cover so that you can see it. And then David, if you could answer that question about time pressure and when you find it helpful to use or not.
So sometimes time pressures are imposed externally. Someone has to catch a plane or there's some other constraint. I tell people I'm going to be the last person to leave the mediation room. I'm going to stick with them as long as they're willing to stick with it. Now, if I think that what's going on is unproductive, I'll say so, and I'll say, here's some ideas, or let's generate some ideas about how to make it more productive. But I think for a mediator to say, I'm only willing to continue this for another hour, and then the mediation is ending, I don't think that's the mediator's place. I think it's the party's decision.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. We're coming really to time, so I apologize to everyone whose questions we weren't able to cover. I will say that we have put in the chat David Hoffman's email address so that you can see it, dhoffman@blc.law, so that any questions that we weren't able to address during this time frame, and I know there are a bunch, we can go to. To the events team, if you could throw up our next slide, Dave, and I will ask you maybe to unshare. All right, perfect. Thank you. So we can talk about the next series of events that are coming up. So first, on February 18th, Professor Jim Spanius and Alex Green will be talking about a case study of a negotiation over Amazon HQ2 site. And then Professor Julia Minson of the Kennedy School on March 26th will be talking about disagreeing better. And between then, I'm sure we'll be scheduling a number of events, but these are all ready. And I'm pointing specifically to the list of our in-person courses, and the two that David will be teaching in are Advanced Mediation Intensive, which will cover this topic of impasse breaking in greater depth from April 27th to 30th, and the Harvard Mediation Intensive, our first level 40-hour mediation course in the month of June. So we look forward to seeing you at another live webinar. Again, the recording of this event will be up on our website by the end of the week in case you'd like to see it. David, congratulations. We had over 470 participants at greatest turnout. That is really incredible. We're so delighted to have kicked off the semester with you, and we look forward to seeing you in our classrooms. Thank you, everybody, and be well.